All right, welcome everyone. This is a kind of a casual stream, but with me I have Cody Browning and the Prudentialist. So Cody, why don't you introduce yourself to my audience?
I'm Cody Browning. I'm exactly as my Twitter bio says, sturdy Midwestern white guy, Catholic. And you can find me on Twitter at Cody B. Presente.
Well, great. As you can probably tell, got a little bit carried away making the thumbnail for this video, and I actually forgot to use your avatar, but your account is linked in the description. So if anyone wants to find you, they can find you there. And obviously, Prude, I assume that my audience knows you, but if you want to just give a short pitch for who you are for someone who might not have been paying attention for the last couple of years.
Well, I've only been here for 2 years, but thank you again for having me on, Jack. Greatly appreciate it. For those of you who might not know me, my name is the Prudentialist. I cover international relations, culture, and various other things on my YouTube channel. Host of the Digital Archipelago with Geo and Prudent Observations covering international relations theory and more. So if those are your things, you can find the frog.
So I will say I've been catching up on your show with Geo, and it's a great show. But I will say I've never actually heard someone laugh so hard that I'm genuinely concerned for their health. But I'm quite concerned that if Geo dies, it will be because he quite literally laughed too hard and forgot to breathe.
I think this is why I save my boomer con interpretation or impersonation, so I don't make him laugh that hard again, because I don't want to kill him.
So anyway, guys, this stream is going to be based off an article, Prude, that you actually sent me that Vox published about Curtis Yarvin. We can get into that a little bit, but do you guys want to, starting first with you, Cody, kind of give your history with Yarvin?
Yeah, I think much like a lot of us here on the online right, we were a little bit disillusioned with, the post-Trump victory and what the Trump White House was looking like and how all these promises were not being kept. I also had a very big sense of that after Brexit didn't really seem to be getting done with the UK, even though I was rooting for our boys across the pond. And all of these mass kind of populist movements all over the world really seemed to start taking off, and like people were voting people in. And I thought, like, oh, this is how we do it, like, the kind of wholesome Carl Benjamin, like we won them with great arguments kind of thing. And then that COVID, the lockdowns. Oh, sorry, should I not have said that?
Oh, don't worry. It's if I was going to get demonetized for saying those words, it would have happened a while ago. So you're all good, within reason, of course.
True. But yeah, just all of those factors that kind of culminated in 2020. I was really looking at my own sort of libertarian principles and really trying to see where power lied. And that's how I got introduced. I think I got introduced to Yarvin a little bit before that, but that's when I started taking him a lot more seriously, especially with channels like Charlemagne and the Prudentialist, who have great videos on him, the cathedral, dark enlightenment, et cetera, et cetera.
And what about you, Prude? When did you become aware of Yarvin?
Probably around 2019, 2020. Just when you start consuming, like a lot of people in their mid-20s and younger, when you consume political content online, eventually people start citing their sources, or you would hope that they do. And, Dave and Charlemagne had done a really good job at making these ideas more accessible to the YouTube audience, but I had found a little bit of unqualified reservations, primarily through my reading of Nick Land first. I knew of Land before Yarvin, but 2020 is when I really started digesting him and getting his ideas and trying to understand them and what still works, what's still applicable. And now I guess everyone and their mother knows who he is, just like this Fox article is. I did not read the article. I just saw that the senator from Connecticut, Murphy, tweeted it out and was complaining in an attack on J.D. Vance and Blake Masters. So I thought that this would be a fun thing to just poke fun at.
Yeah, and I think I've read half of it, skimmed the rest, and it is fit for purpose. I'll put it that way. So as far as my exposure to Yarvin, I want to say it might have been 2016 or 2017, because as I've said before, George Bagby, consistent guest on the channel, was my high school history teacher, among other things. And he was a kind of a long-term, lurker on the internet, right? Been around forever, since kind of like the original 2006, 2007, like Ron Paul days, and then kind of like morphing into, what became kind of like the alternative right. That's a word I actually can't say. I've gotten dinged for that one before, and a few other things. And he was a original reader of Unqualified Reservations when it was still active. So, around the time, of the 2008 election. And so I think that he, as he was kind of mentoring me, pointed me to Yarvin. And I'll be perfectly honest, like a lot of things, I was just not. I read Yarvin, but didn't get very much from him. And it took a few years of, maturation and actually a little bit of help, as, we've mentioned before, from Charlemagne to kind of get back into it. And recently, even over the past year, I've gone back through and read, both the Open Letter to an Open-Minded Progressive and How Dawkins Got Pwned, which I do think are kind of his best work, at least from my perspective. And obviously, if you guys want to find that, Skeptical Waves on his channel has full narrations of both of those. So even if you're an illiterate peasant, you can go through those, which I do recommend. And it's been interesting, like you said, Prue, that kind of everyone and their mother knows Yarvin now, because like recently, as in like the last couple months, my fiance asked me if I knew who Curtis Yarvin was. And that was one of the most surreal moments ever, because, I try not to lose my spaghetti too often and just like lecture my, friends about, obscure internet intellectuals. But he really has kind of exploded in popularity. And so I'm not necessarily surprised this article was written, but nonetheless, it is kind of surreal to see it. So anyway, guys, I'm going to share my screen and we can get into the article directly. Oh, shoot. Let me know if you guys can see my screen as I just fumble around. Awesome. Can you guys see it?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to check out this guy's Twitter account. Oh, never mind. It's not the article. Never mind. Okay. In September 2021, J.D. Vance, a GOP candidate for Senate in Ohio, appeared on a conservative podcast to discuss what is to be done with the United States, and his proposals were dramatic. He urged Trump, should he win another term, to seize the institutions of the left, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat in the U.S. government, and replace them with our people, and to defy the Supreme Court if it tries to stop him. To the uninitiated, all that might seem stunning, but Vance acknowledged he had an intellectual inspiration. So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who has written about some of these things. Now, what's odd to me about this is that this block, and look, I realize that pointing your fingers at the left and saying, haha, look, they're not consistent isn't particularly productive. But he's essentially describing what the left has done for generations to maintain power. And of course, when it's your guy, when it's FDR defying the Supreme Court, well, that's great because he's FDR. But when J.D. Vance suggested, of course, it's, threatening to our, capital D democracy.
I just want to know what podcast he was on. I want to know if I want to know if I listened to this one and I missed the episode. Oh, well, then I definitely missed it.
This is why I'm saying the hyperlinks to this article are almost as good as the article itself.
Oh my. Well, that's almost perfect. A bunch of Claremont. Well, it's more of an indictment of the Claremont Institute than anything else.
Is that the same one? Okay, anyway.
Yeah, that's him.
Anyway, not to get on a completely separate tangent. Nearly a decade earlier, a Stanford law student named Blake Masters, asked by a friend for reading recommendations for a book club, emailed a link to a set of blog posts. These posts made an argument that was quite unusual in the American context, asserting that the democratically elected U.S. government should be abolished and replaced with a monarchy. Its author, then writing synonymously, was Yarvin. Masters is now the GOP Senate nominee in Arizona. At a campaign event last year, according to Vanity Fair's James Pogue, he was asked how he'd actually drain the swamp in Washington. One of my friends has this acronym he calls RAGE, retire all government employees, Masters answered. You probably guessed who that friend is.
I do like how the way that this guy writes, or the way that I guess like the quotes that he's pulling kind of sounds like me if I'm like at a bar or at a party with friends. It's like, all right, so there's this guy who goes by Mencius Moldbug, but he actually is called Curtis Yarvin. He talks a lot about Thomas Carlyle, who's also like this 19th century Scottish.
Well,
Yeah,
it
it's
is
like
it's overly conversational, and I find it's not unclear in the sense that it's like overwrought, but I it's not particularly well written. Like there are many times where it's just like, okay, we could have done with a sentence half this long and just more direct, but that's
It has a Cliff Clavin feel to it. Like, well, there's this guy, and just we're pulling out all sorts of stuff to throw spaghetti at the wall and make the case work for it. Like, we got this already. James Pogue already wrote the article in Vanity Fair. Like, what are we doing here? But we need to know. We need an electoral midterm, hit piece article.
And that's very much what it seems like.
Also, you've probably guessed who the friend is a sentence midwits like to type to feel smart.
Yeah, I don't like stuff like that, like begging the question. It's irritating. In many thousand words worth of blog posts over the past 15 years, computer programmer and tech startup founder Yarvin has laid out a critique of American democracy, arguing that it's liberals in elite academic institutions, media outlets, and the permanent bureaucracy who hold true power in this declining country, while the U.S. executive branch has become weak, incompetent, and captured. I mean, yeah, pretty much. And obviously he's saying that like he disagrees with it, but he basically just says it in a mocking tone and never actually refutes it.
Yeah, that's another thing about like liberal media. What you just pointed out, Jack. They're writing for an audience that they already kind of assume to know, like, okay, you're on my team, so I'm just going to say something and kind of make it in this little, like, oh, we can all see how ridiculous this is, right, guys?
Right, but he never actually addresses it. It's basically just a little bit of, guilt by association, and we'll get into that. I don't want to, ruin the flow of this extremely interesting article. But he stands out among right-wing commentators for being probably the single person who spent the most time gaming out how exactly the U.S. government could be toppled and replaced or rebooted or reset, as he likes to say, with a monarch, CEO, or dictator at the helm. Yarvin argues that a creative and visionary leader, a startup guy, like he says Napoleon or Lenin was, should seize absolute power, dismantle the old regime, and build something new in its place. To Yarvin, incremental reforms and half measures are necessarily doomed. The only way to achieve what he wants is to assume absolute power, and the game is all about getting to a place where you can pull that off. Critics have called this idea as fascist, a term he disputes, arguing that centralizing power under one ruler long predates fascism, and that his ideal monarch should rule for all rather than fomenting a class war as fascists do. Autocratic fits as a descriptor, though his preferred term is monarchist. You won't find many on the right saying that they wholly support Yarvin's program, especially the monarchy thing. But his critique of the status quo and some of his ideas for changing it have influenced several increasingly prominent figures. I will say, this is quite a funny article. I read this one in your own time, but it's kind of like the shrieking, pearl clutching you'd imagine. Okay, I'm just kind of clicking through these because there are some of them, and I should have saved them that are quite amusing. Do you guys have anything to add so far?
Well, the guy who wrote on Popular Front, John Gans, he's one of those people. I think he blocked me on Twitter because he's one of those people that calls everyone unironically a fascist. Just like I know the guy's name isn't Jacob Borowski, but what's his? He's the Jacob Borowski professor of philosophy at Yale.
I've got nothing on that one, but carry on.
Oh, Jason Stanley, my bad. Oh yeah, no. So some people call him a fascist, and you link to a Substack article. That's really great reporting, guys.
Yeah, really. And this is it almost seems, because I worked for an SEO company for a while, like all of these hyperlinks are a term to kind of boost your posts in the algorithm. That's neither here nor there, but it is something interesting to note. Prue, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I was about to say, it just feels like algorithmically, here's all the stuff that you would need to know that I'm totally right about my worldview. Although Jason Stanley's pretty entertaining. He makes Umberto Eco, his idea of what is fascism, just, babies first. baby's first fascism. It's just it's oversimplified. Anything is fascist, and that's what we're going to do ad nauseum, as we have been doing for like the last century.
Well, it's very much like that, that old kind of 2017 meme of the children's book that says everyone I don't like is a fascist. An intellectual midget's guide to politics. I mean, it's odd because there are very much some people for whom the world has never changed since 2016, and obviously we say that kind of punitively, but it is odd when you see someone who very much has been writing the exact same articles for 5 years now, and you just kind of feel like, look, man, like maybe a little bit of self-reflection, like just a bit, but that might be asking too much.
Well, yeah, not to mention the fact that this article's purpose is going to be, we're going to take James Pogue's article, which was fair and pretty balanced on these issues, and we're going to turn this into a hit piece against a movement that actually wants to acknowledge that there are structural problems with the U.S. government. This is why they flipped their stuff earlier when Orrin McIntyre and I covered the whole Schedule F federal employees thing. Like, these are modest milquetoast proposals to make a dent in the problem that Yarvin calls the cathedral, at least from the federal government level, and we're watching them being sent into absolute hysterics.
Well, and one of the things, because I was talking to Dan, from AA streams yesterday. And to me, and maybe I'm being kind of overly naive, but the kind of the Thiel, I guess, power block, seems to me kind of the first time in a while that we've seen an actual kind of like concerted effort to make the Republican Party kind of a real competing power block. And look, I realize there's the MAGA crowd, but that's a little bit more disorganized. And, obviously, look, like I'm not in love with Thiel as a guy, but it does seem interesting that there is some kind of, it seems like real, I guess, like interested group of elites in making, at least some of the Republican Party actually like an effective political bloc. You agree with that? Either one of you guys.
Oh, well, I think that there's definitely a faction that wants to move things in a direction that fits their own image. I don't know. This is the thing that I've written about a lot on Substack on these issues, is that if you're going to like change things and put them in a direction, like you're one set of coastal elites that are trying to replace another, you still need to make your vision pretty palatable to the people that you're going to rule over, especially if you want to restructure it or even work in the democratic process. And so I remain cautiously optimistic with these guys, but I don't think that, they have my best interest at heart.
I think that largely summarizes my feelings as well. But carry on, Cody.
Yeah, I don't think they really have any of our particular interests, or that they have any of our particular views. But at the same time, if they're kind of scaring all the libs with what Prude said was like pretty much milquetoast observations about structural problems within the government, and like the whole article opened up with, oh, Trump should fire employees who are not loyal to him and just staff a new bureaucracy. It's not as if they're calling for dissolution of Congress or suspending the Supreme Court or, jailing political dissidents, which has already happened to people on our side of things.
Oh, that's well said. Besides Vance and Masters, whose campaign declined to comment for this story, good, Yarvin has had decades-long associations with billionaire Peter Thiel, who is similarly disillusioned with democracy and American government. I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible, Thiel wrote in 2009. Earlier this year, he declared that Republican members of Congress who voted for Trump's impeachment after the January 6 attacks were traitorous. Fox host Tucker Carlson is another fan, interviewing Yarvin with some fascination for his streaming program last year. He's even influenced online discourse. Yarvin was the first to popularize the analogy from The Matrix of being red-pilled or pilled, suddenly losing your illusions and seeing the supposed reality of the world more clearly as applied to politics. That very much felt like explaining the term red-pilled to your grandparents, but overall,
yeah,
Yarvin,
Grandma, there's this movie called The Matrix, and some people say it's a trans allegory, but Yarvin makes a political one.
There's this guy, American Krogan.
okay, so there's the red pill, and then there's this other guy, Devin Stack, who lives in the desert, and he talks about the black pill a lot.
Be careful. Overall, Yarvin is arguably the leading intellectual figure on the new right, a movement of thinkers and activists critical of the traditional Republican establishment, who argue that an elite left ruling class has captured and is ruining America, and that drastic measures are necessary to fight back against them. And new right ideas are getting more influential among the Republican staffers and politicians. Trump's advisors are already brainstorming Yarvinite, or at least Yarvin Light, ideas for the second term. I want to see what that link leads to, such as firing thousands of federal civil servants and replacing them with Trump loyalists. With hundreds of election deniers on the ballot this year, another disputed presidential election could happen soon, and Yarvin has written a playbook for the power grab he hopes will then unfold. I'm going to come back to this.
This is the article Oren McIntyre and I covered. Like we're covering just the last 6 months of news.
Yeah, I was about to say, because a lot of this does feel like it's like the Bizarro World version of the last 6 months of the right. It does very much feel like like my evil twin could have written this article.
It's like the quote from J.D. Vance at the beginning of this is from 2021. We're reading an article from 6 months ago that was just a better version of this. And they're talking about the new right as if we didn't have guys like Pat Buchanan or Sam Francis or Joe Sobran who were pointing out the exact same things just in the 80s of an elite left ruling class as captured as ruining America. These are not exactly new ideas or new venues that talking heads on the right or within the Republicans have discussed before.
So if I'm not mistaken, wasn't there recently kind of a storm in a teacup over Blake Masters quoting Sam Francis? I think there was some kind of hullabaloo around that over the last couple weeks. He
had his TikTok account where he had shown, apparently the video was taken down, or I don't know how TikTok works, but he had a clip of his bookshelf, and one of them was Sam Francis's Beautiful Losers, and everyone, went tits up about it.
I'm always surprised because I think it's very easy to get kind of siloed, on the internet. I really do forget that there is a significant group of people who thinks that, Sam Francis is a full-on, mustache wearing bad man, to the point of that kind of hysteria. And just to me, it's I've only known him kind of in the context that we see him, so it's odd to see him or see the more I guess, traditional view of him, thanks to D'Souza, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Sam Francis is effective because they're still spitting on his grave. They're still, I can't remember who it was. It was some probably 3 to 8,000 follower political insider account that was saying all these terrible things about Sam Francis, and then all the quote tweets are just guys like us coming to his defense. So Francis still strikes a chord with people, and I really don't think that the kind of I guess you could say white interests or certain political beliefs that he talked about in the 80s and 90s, I really don't think that those labels are really as effective as they once were.
Oh, well, speaking of just going through the last 6 months of news and stuff like that, I found Andrew Prokop's Twitter, the author of this article. The last thing he tweeted was 20 hours ago, where he's literally going at a November 8th, 2020 article that Trump officials should just declassify. He's literally citing almost a 2-year-old Gray Mirror article. It's he's discovered the big bad, wolf, and he's going to expose him. And it's just where have you been, man?
No, definitely. And that's why it very much does kind of feel like an article out of time. It obviously, to a certain extent, it is, referencing current events, but really it does kind of feel like stepping through a time portal.
It's kind of like when Tucker had on Raw Egg Nationalists and all of these right-wing bodybuilders, and people were horrified and calling them all gay. And it's kind of I mean, I know this stuff isn't
mainstream. First time.
Yeah, exactly.
First time, bro. And it's like, yeah, like you can't just like discover Yarvin when so many people have already just kind of tossed him at this point because of the whole Dark Elves thing. And you can't like Raleigh Nationalist has like tens of thousands of followers. You can't be like surprised that he's like on Tucker and that guys are doing this stuff.
Well,
they really are that out of like the loop politically, at least on our side of things.
Fair. So these ideas are no longer entirely just abstract musings. It's unclear how many powerful people may take Yarvin entirely literally, but many do take him seriously. After the 2020 election crisis, the fall of American democracy seems rather more plausible than it used to.
Based.
To better understand the ideas influencing a growing number of conservative elites now, and the battles that may lie ahead, I reviewed much of Yarvin's sizable body of work, and I interviewed him. Rookie mistake. During our lengthy conversation, Yarvin argued that the eventual fall of U.S. democracy could be fundamentally joyous and peaceful. Yet the steps President Trump took in that direction after the 2020 election were not particularly joyous and peaceful, and it was hard for me to see why further movement down that road would be. Ugh, just shit-lib hand-wringing. In Yarvin's telling, his political awakening occurred during the 2004 election. A computer programmer living in Silicon Valley, he was then an avid reader of political blogs following the Swiftboat's Veterans for Truth scandal about whether Democratic nominee John Kerry had lied about aspects of his military service. Yarvin thought it was clear Kerry had lied and felt the media went to stunning lengths to protect him and smear his accusers. But he also became disillusioned with the conservative response, which he thought amounted to ineffectively complaining about media bias and continuing with politics as usual. The problem, he felt, was far deeper. I don't know how old you are, Cody, but do you remember that scandal?
I'm not old enough to where I was like politically active or like I knew what was going on, but I do remember when Kerry was running, and I do remember that was just that was kind of like a punchline on nighttime TV for a while.
Prue, do you have anything to add on that front?
Yeah, I mean, you can find this clip on YouTube of where he talks about this bit, Yarvin saying that that's his first red pill. But no, that was the first election I really paid attention to intensely because, you know, when your dad's in the army and it's just like, oh, well, this determines where the war's going. Like, you kind of want to be involved as a kid just to know what's going on. I really remember that and the, you know, I think it was Dan Rather saying that, you know, oh, Bush lied about his military service. And then turns out it was, you know, Rather bullshitting himself. But it was good times.
In an intense period of reading old books on political theory and history to contemplate how the systems work followed. Eventually, he, as he put it, stopped believing in democracy, comparing this realization to how formerly religious people feel when they stop believing in God. Soon, he began posting blog comments and then writing a self-styled anti-democracy blog, beginning in 2007 under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. In these writings, discursive, filled with historical references, wry, and often gleefully offensive, I want to see what that hyperlink leads to, he laid out a sort of grand theory of why America is broken and how it can be fixed. Oof. What? Why is that's a stupid thing to leave?
Oh, he linked to the Wikipedia reference.
yeah, exactly. Like that's the again.
This is so lazy.
Yeah, that's again like okay, link to the actual quote. But anyway, why America is broken and how it can be fixed. The U.S. government is a sclerotic, decaying institution that can no longer achieve great or even competent things, and as he now puts it, just sucks. Constrained by the separation of powers in Congress, the president has negligible power to achieve his agenda in contrast to the deep state, bureaucracy, and the nonprofits that are permanent fixtures of Washington's governing class. I mean, is he wrong? Really? Do you guys have anything to say on that one? Because, I mean, that seems just manifestly true.
From my experience, liberals have this very weird selective patriotism that every time that like they're in power or their power is being threatened, you can just say it's like, oh, well, like you hate the system, you hate America, you hate this country. And like I'm old enough to remember when the liberals were the ones saying it's like, hey, we don't really have a democracy, we have an oligarchy, like we're owned by all these corporations and like they have final say. Now when we say it, you know, we're like anti-American, or when we say it, we have like these crazy ideas of like, oh, like what? Like you hate the government, you hate your country now. Yeah, they have this it's a selective kind of patriotism to guard their own skin, like when they're in power, but they're more than happy to point out like all the inequalities and such, like when Republicans have power.
Well, I mean, it kind of plays in perfectly to Yarvin's concept of the two-story state. And just, we have these competing historical, political, and, these meta-narratives about the nation. They have theirs, which is, antithetical and self-destructive to our, narrative of what the United States would be. And here we are. But the other purpose of this article, though, right, alongside the midterms, is to make this for Vox readers. Vox readers are not on right-wing Twitter, except maybe when they get quote tweeted and ratioed by people like JJ the Jackoff Plane or Kove Theanot or something. Not because they care about us. That's why after James Pogue's piece, the New York Times put out that article, call for reporters to do the e-right beat and things like that. This is for the liberal audience. This is for audiences to know that the internet needs to be, a place where dangerous bloggers will influence U.S. politics that support the destruction of democracy, and we're going to go back to 1950. It's informing their lovely white middle-class liberal audience, as well as their multicultural bio-Leninist readers, that things could go back to 1950 if this scary guy who claims to read the international to really take over things.
No, and I think that's good to remember that we are not the target audience of this. That I would argue that Vox isn't even really for the elite in the same way that something like the New York Times is, or the WAPO is, or something like that. Like I at least sincerely hope that no one with an important job reads Vox, right? Like Vox is for the like lumpen proletariat, like sociology degree holding millennial. At least in my experience, that's who reads it. And so this very much feels like a kind of like preloading a narrative of, this election is the most important election in history because, it's a risk to our democracy. And so I genuinely think that it is just kind of a lazy article, where the guy is kind of going through the most recent things he's read, quoting Wikipedia and then slapping it together with a neat bow at the end. Do you have anything there, Cody?
I guess I'm wondering, like, do these guys know that they're probably like juicier and like better people to follow than Yarvin that we all know about and interact with and talk to? I mean, do they even know, or are they really just this surface level?
Well, I just genuinely think that they don't care. It doesn't really, it doesn't matter to them. I think that despite all like the pageantry, they kind of see themselves as being in charge, and so obviously it matters to the point where it, impacts kind of like close purple state elections, or, serves as a club to, to beat your opponents with. But realistically, like, writing an article about some, right-wing Anon Groiper account, that may have 20,000 followers, before they get zucked. But, as long as Blake Masters doesn't interact with it, like, why do they care? Past a certain point. But anyway.
Well, they still play the nasty association game of people. Like, apparently Blake Masters had a hit piece set out against him because apparently someone on his staff was like some American first self-described Christian nationalist that works with some organization, and it's just like, oh, the rest of us would be like, well, who cares? But for them, it's to drum up fear about that. I mean, this whole threat to democracy thing is the same thing like climate change. It's the same thing that Yarvin has made out about this, is that this is a religion. In a lot of ways, it's formulated that way because, well, you have to side with us or the enemy will win, and then we can't be saved by the amazing, salvation powers of democracy or whatever.
I'm always curious because I feel like this is when you start to see things kind of formally, deified rather, is when they will start kind of capitalizing democracy, in the same way that they capitalize, black or the other kind of like words of the regime. That's just one of those things I'm continually on the lookout for. Troop, did I already read the section about the cathedral?
No.
All right, true power in the US is held by the cathedral, elite academic and media institutions that, in Yarvin's telling, set the bounds of acceptable political discourse and distort reality to fit their preferred ideological frames. This does not unfold as a centralized conspiracy, but rather through a shared worldview and culture, and it's his explanation for why society keeps moving to the left through the decades. It's not just that the current government that sucks. Democracy sucks too. Sometimes he denounces democracy entirely, calling it a dangerous, malignant form of government. Sometimes he says democracy doesn't even practically exist in the US because voters don't have true power over the government as compared to those with other interests, which functions as an oligarchy. Sometimes he argues that organization in which leadership is shared or divided simply aren't effective.
You started 3 sentences with sometimes.
I didn't even notice that, but he really did. That's actually quite irritating. Far preferable, in his view, would be a government run like most corporations, with one leader holding absolute power over those below, though perhaps accountable to a board of directors of sorts. He admits that an unaccountable autocracy is a real problem. This monarch/CEO would have the ability to actually run things unbothered by pesky civil servants, judges, voters, the public, or the separation of powers. How do we achieve effective management? We know one simple way: find the right person and put him or her in charge. So I would say that, and this is not a particularly original Moldbug take, that this is kind of the weakest part of his argument. The neo-cameralism stuff, it's a little bit shaky. And obviously there's some of it that kind of flows directly from his, broader condemnations of democracy. But I would say that that's, by far the part of it that's the kookiest and the least applicable, really. It does kind of seem like he's just kind of, throwing spaghetti at the wall.
Yeah, that neo-cameralism definitely just that, or his take on sort of how to fix things for the world, like the old ideas about how to apply neo-cameralism to Europe and have all these little microstates, sort of old style HRE bits. But you can't go back to it. But one of the biggest things about Yarvin that people always need to remember is that you're looking at this. Yarvin looks at things like from a tech brain Silicon Valley perspective. This is why, his go-to analogy is that it's a startup. We have to treat government like a startup and go that direction, when it's a lot more than that.
It kind of reminds me of my old libertarian days and reading Hoppe and things of that nature. If we all just had anarchist societies, and if we all just had covenant communities, everything would be dope. Everything would be cool. It's not just how normal things work, and you can't just run people's lives as if you're a CEO, which is Prude mentioned is kind of part of his tech background, the way that he views the world.
For some years, Yarvin was something of an odd internet curiosity, with his ideas far from most political conservatives' radar. He gained one prominent reader, Thiel, who had written about his own disillusionment with democracy, became a Yarvin friend, and funded a startup. He's fully enlightened, Yarvin later wrote of Thiel in an email. Just plays it very carefully. Thiel did not respond to a request for comment. Good. Learn from this guy. Never respond to them. Beyond that, idea bloggers like Robin Hanson and Scott Alexander argued with him, and he gradually got more attention for being a leading figure in the neo-reactionary. Here's where that leads.
Oh, hit that link. It's hilarious.
This might be fun to come back to.
Oh my gosh, it's neo-reactionary cat from 2012.
Oh, that's a blaster in the past. Though his blog was pseudonymous, he had not made a particularly extensive effort to keep his identity secret, appearing in person as Moldbug to give a talk at a conference, blah, blah, blah. That's not particularly important. The sticking points commonly cited by his critics included one Moldbug post on historical thought about slavery, which was seized on as proof that he was pro-slavery and racist. As a response, he said he believes in the biological roots of intelligence and does not believe that all populations or racial groups are equally intelligent on average, but he insisted racism was despicable, and he said he did not believe that Europeans have any inherent or moral superiority over other races. Another post that spurred outrage discussed some things I'm not going to say. You guys
Well, we did conquer the world.
Going straight for the throat there. He basically mentioned, a very naughty Norwegian. Yarvin argued that the political organization of left heroes like Che Guevara and Nelson Mandela also murdered civilians and that they should face condemnation too.
Oh, his article though on the certain situation that happened with, let's just say AB, the whole article's about what he calls folk activism. It's not that particularly. It's rather sort of indicting him and his actions and what he did as just like it was piss poor.
No, I completely agree, and it's obviously it's taken out of context. And maliciously so. I mean, you guys can find the essay yourself, and it really doesn't.
Just listen to it
indicate.
over with waves.
Yeah, fair enough. Skeptical Waves, you can find that one too. I mean, I feel like on a lot of things, like especially around both racial and sexual minorities, Yarvin's pretty tepid to a certain degree, right? He still kind of has those, at least to me, those liberal sensibilities from my reading of him.
He still kind of does that, like, I guess, like, how could you describe, I mean, like, the way that, like, Yarvin, like, doesn't respond to this article, but the way that he responds to allegations of, like, racism and, like, other things that he said, he's doing the, like, well, hey, like, AB was bad, but look, they have Che Guevara. And it's like, yeah, of course they have Che Guevara because they're in power. They can put him on T-shirts and no one cares.
Right. Yeah. It's an odd tact for someone who is, on one hand, got the theory crafting right, but in a weird way, almost kind of like struggles to put it into practice. The very fact that he did respond to this interview is, I feel like, a strike against him.
Yeah, imagine if the roles were reversed, kind of posting and like, well, I'll get my side out by agreeing to this, second-rate publication for an interview.
That's being very generous to Vox, by the way. Yarvin was out of the blogging game for the early Trump years, though he did attend Thiel's watch party for the 2016 election. But in his time away, his influence seemed to grow. To some on the right, Yarvin's longtime obsession seemed both prescient and clarifying. The cathedral anticipated the Great Awakening, in scare quotes. Let's see where that leads. Oh, wow. Well, this looks
more
fun.
Self-referential. Wait. Go to that article. Who's the author?
Matt Iglesias.
Oh, okay. I thought this was going to be a little masturbatory where he cites himself, but at least he didn't do that so far.
Yeah, no, he has not cited himself. I will say there are several people I will not allow myself to interact with on Twitter because they have resulted in several of my friends, obviously not me, getting banned on Twitter before, and Matt Iglesias is one of them. So
I let all Matt Iglesias interactions go to Steve Saylor.
He really that's why that man was born to dunk on Matt Iglesias.
That golf course is the one image the liberals fear most.
And social justice wars, as Jacob Siegel has written, citing that article again, presidential powerlessness before the deep state predicted Trump's struggles in getting his agenda done. Additionally, Trump himself proved a filter of sorts to the conservative intellectual class, as the president disdained the norms of classically liberal democracy. Oh my. Conservatives who were attached to those norms either self-selected out of the party or got purged. Those pro-Trump intellectual space was taken by the new right thinkers arguing the left's control of culture, society, and government had gotten so bad that extreme measures were necessary to reverse it, and that the previous GOP leaders were too hesitant to fully recognize they're in a war and they need to fight back.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, pretty much. I mean, this is essentially just liberal wants conservatives to be liberal. Like, I mean, really, it's not that shocking. Take for instance, Vance, in explaining to podcast host Jack Murphy why he became a Trump supporter after initially disdaining him. Vance said, "I saw and realized something about the American elite and about my role in the American elite, and that took me a while to figure out. I was red-pilled," using the reference Yarvin helped popularize. "We are a late Republican period," Vance told Murphy. "If we're going to push back against it, we're going to have to get pretty wild and pretty far out there and go in directions that a lot of conservatives right now are uncomfortable with." Do you guys have anything to add to what Vance is quoted saying there?
Keep pushing things in a rightward direction. Like, great, Moldbug is mainstream. Time to keep moving things in a direction that's less crazy to the left and more, amicable towards normalcy, which is apparently extreme fringe right wing these days.
I will not stop posting until Thomas777 is on Tucker Carlson tonight.
Well, it is very much like and this is why and I've posted on my my private Telegram about this. It's actually not private, and you guys can join if you want to. Just follow it on my link. Shameless shilling. But I've kind of said that really, like, the people I hate the most in this are people like David French. People who are very much kind of the quote unquote good conservatives in this guy's mind. Because look, like, these people are your enemies. They don't want good things for you. And so why are you surprised that they don't say nice things about you? Of course they don't. They're your enemies. They want to use power against you. And if you're obsessed, and I realize that the people who need to hear this are not listening to this, but if you're obsessed with, obtaining the validation of your enemies, the only way you can do that is by, laying down and letting them do whatever they want. Of course that's the only way that they're going to like you. And just kind of endlessly, prostrating yourself to get essentially like head pats from your enemies it's disgusting.
It's what Jonathan Bowden said, it's moral syphilis. We're stepping over it. You're really at a point where if you think you're in a war for civilization, you don't really have anything to lose by having people that already hate you even more.
No, that's well said. After Yarvin stepped away from the startup, the company behind Urbit, in 2019, The American Mind, the online publication of the Claremont Institute, began publishing his essays, effectively welcoming him into the now mainstream discourse on the right. He became a frequent guest on the New Right podcast, and in 2020 started a Substack, at first using it to post excerpts from an in-progress book, but eventually returning to his blogging roots. Then when Trump tried and failed to overturn that year's election result, Yarvin's longtime interest in regime change suddenly became far more relevant. So this is kind of funny. My personal story around the Jan 6 thing is actually quite funny. Me and my now roommate, one of my best friends, had been exposed to COVID, and this was kind of still in the days when no one really knew how serious getting exposed to COVID was, or at least not in the same way. And so essentially, like, we were kind of like, all right, well, we've got a quarantine. That's the thing that you do. And so he had a barn on his farm, and it's heated, but kind of barely. So we're camped out in his barn, and all of a sudden, the Jan 6 thing is going on, and Yarvin posted his article about January 6th, where he compared it to a game of Halo, right? And he basically said the Jan 6 protests work on combat evolved rules, where they think that if you just stand in the control point for 30 seconds, you win the game and get to become king of America. But I thought it was a very funny, take on it. But in my infinite wisdom, I decided to send that article to my, State Department spook, who I'm, kind of friends with. And I got one of the most concerned emails I've ever gotten back. Like, why would you say this is an attack on our democracy? And that was kind of when I realized, like, oh, wait, like, this isn't the kind of like funny event I think it is. Like, this is going to be, kind of shit-lib 9/11. But I did think his article on it was, not half bad.
Yeah, it's definitely shit-lib 9/11, but oh man, was it just before everything went to crap that day, like the first half of that of January, it was just the perfect moment of catharsis of like, look at these people cower,
Yeah,
right. You see how weak they are, really.
I was playing War Pigs by Black Sabbath on my train ride that day.
Talk of an American coup may sound bizarre, but coups are not that weird. Again, write this like an adult, please. They happen in other countries, and in Yarvin's telling, they've even happened in the U.S. Sort of. He argues that Hamilton, Lincoln, and Roosevelt each so sweepingly expanded presidential power, centralizing authority and establishing new departments, they can be said to have founded new regimes. It seems like a relatively milquetoast taste. Like, I guess maybe I'm just so far down the rabbit hole, but that seems to me like, even in liberal circles, like relatively like normal, as a take.
I mean, it's really like, how many liberals, really do love Lincoln, or maybe at least pretend to, or they do all the Sherman posting of like burning down the South, or they talk about like how FDR saved us as a country. Like, it's really not that, it's not like all those powers just like all of a sudden went away. It's really not that controversial to say that's like, yeah, like whatever we imagine this thing to be obviously is not the same government in a post 1933 or post Nuremberg world.
Well, and it's especially odd because it's pretty easy to recognize it in other systems. Like the French have kind of formalized it in their different republics, but I mean, I guess like it says America on the outside of the box, but I mean, quite obviously, shit libs are kind of comfortable with talking about the civil rights revolution or something like that. Like to me, it just doesn't seem, particularly noteworthy. Now, admittedly, I don't think this is a very good faith article, but it was kind of at least surprising to me that would be objectionable. But Yarvin wants to see something even more dramatic in posts such as reflections on the late election and the butterfly revolution, and podcast appearances such as those with Michael Anton and writer Brian Chow. Yarvin laid out many specific ideas on how the system could be fully toppled and replaced with something like a centralized monarchy. Sometimes he frames this as what Trump should have done in 2020, what he shouldn't or should but won't do in 2024, or what some other candidate should do in the future if they want to seize power. But Trump will never do anything like this, Yarvin wrote. But I can't disguise my belief that someone should. Someone worthy of the task, of course. It is basically a set of thought experiments about how to dismantle U.S. democracy and its current system of government. Writer John Gans, reviewing some of Yarvin's proposals, concluded, if that's not the product of a fascist imagination, I don't know what possibly could be. Many of those... Actually, isn't Italian futurism quite literally the product of fascist imagination? That's outside the scope of this, but many of these are similar to events preceding the fall of democracies elsewhere in the world. Again, Yarvin's prominent fans like Vance and Masters wouldn't fully endorse this program. Masters told NBC that he would have a different prescription of what to do than Yarvin, and he believes in the Constitution, but some aspects of it have caught their interest. Campaign on it and win. First off, the would-be dictator should seek a mandate from the people by running for president and openly campaigning on the platform of, as he put it, if I'm elected, I'm going to assume absolute power in Washington and rebuild the government. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, refreshingly honest, if nothing else. You guys have anything to add to the last couple paragraphs?
That's just basically where Yarvin says whoever takes power should just recite the last 10 paragraphs of FDR's inaugural and just go from there. He calls it like the ultimate election to seize a mandate and to formalize complete control. Making everything that for us, I guess, down the rabbit hole are familiar with accessible to the audience and trying to make it a big old bugaboo that is mainstream.
You have anything to add, Cody?
I mean, not really. It's something that past presidents have done before, and it's a signal that the Republican Party is the outer party, the punching bag, and the Democratic Party is, in fact, the inner party. Joe Biden, I think recently said it's like, yeah, as soon as I'm elected, I'm going to codify Roe because it's been like the law of the land for 50 years because like he can just, Roe basically made that certain medical procedure legal across all 50 states with no restrictions. And he's just basically going to say, okay, it wasn't like abortion was made illegal by that. It was given back to the states. And he's just like, okay, I'm going to codify it. Like everyone kind of already agrees with this and wants their guy to do it, but they have to make it seem like it's this fascist boogeyman takeover the U.S.
The idea here would be not to frame this as destroying the American system, but rather as improving a broken system that so many are frustrated with. Congress is unpopular, the courts are unpopular, the federal government is unpopular. Why not just promise to govern as president as you see fit without their interference and see if people like that idea? Yeah, why not? It's direct democracy, isn't it? You're not that far from a world in which you can have a candidate in 2024, even maybe, making that pledge, Yarvin continued. I think you could get away with it. That's sort of what people already thought was happening with Trump, he said. To do it for real does not make them much more hysterical. And he laughed. It's actually much more effective. I kind of don't disagree with that. Like realistically, we saw them freak out, to quote Kanye, go DEFCON 3, on Trump for so many years. And I mean, like, obviously they got him. They sent the FBI after him, but that's essentially because he lost. They can shriek as much as they want, but I mean, let us not forget, these are foxes, not lions. Do you guys have anything to add?
Well, like Yarvin said, God doesn't like it when you play pretend, and you can't put up the aesthetic of a big bad strong man and to encourage your people to go out there and do it and then not do anything.
Well, didn't you hear, Prude? He tried to wrestle away the steering wheel of his limo to go back to the Capitol. Remember?
I mean, it just makes him sound more based, but like, come the hell on, Like, this is the thing. Like, I think Turnip and I have shared this sentiment before, but like, it really frustrates me when I drive through rural America, where like these shackled down places of drug-addled rural America holding on to their Trump 2024 flags or the Let's Go Brandon flags. Like, they're holding on to the myth of Prester John. And I just get so mad at Trump. I'm like, you fucking traitor. But, neither here nor there.
No. I mean, I feel the same way, as another guy who lives in kind of like rural America. I feel for those people, and it's part of the reason that, like, I just can't make myself root for Trump. I just look at him as someone who essentially sold out his people. His people are rotting in jail and he hasn't offered them anything. Okay, maybe he made a post on Truth Social about it. Great. And what did that accomplish? Nothing. Bannon's going to serve time. Jones is going to be ruined. All of, his guys, so to speak, are getting screwed. And fair enough, maybe he couldn't do anything now, but it just shows him for the, kind of like the impotent figure he really is. It no longer seems clear that voters would reject such a pitch. Trump's ascendancy already proves, I want to read that one too, that many American voters are no longer so enamored of niceties about the rule of law and civics class pieties about the greatness of the American separated power system. Yes, political messaging about threats to democracy has polled poorly this year. Inshallah, with voters not particularly engaged by it. Oh, wow, this is quite the splash page. The Rise of American. I'm going to save this one too because this one looks good. I'm going to do a little bit of extracurricular reading after the stream because all of these look really funny. Another piece of advice Yarvin has in his vein is that the would-be dictator should try to prevent Blue America from feeling so terrified about the new regime that they take to the streets and make all of it fall apart. Instead, ideally, liberals and leftists should feel so disillusioned with the status quo that they're ready for something new. He thought things were on a promising trajectory on this front during the early Biden admin, but is griped that the Dobbs decision may have scuttled this by firing up Blue America. This is an odd complaint, that he's like, yeah, and Yarvin wants to be really nice to liberals. Isn't that sinister? Like that's an odd complaint, for someone to be making.
It's also weird. It's because like they already have everything and they're throwing our people in jail and ruining lives. But maybe like if things get so bad enough, like some sort of accelerationist jargon, if things get so bad, then like, they'll welcome us as heroes. And so I guess this is me being more angry at Yarvin than at the article. But like, no, just like take power, assume it, and just tell these people what for. Like I'm really done with like this, like, we can only lose the culture war kind of thing.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of my primary contention with Moldbug, is his take on the culture war. And I feel like that comes, very much from his, from kind of his cultural background as a left close blue elite.
I mean, he called himself a rootless cosmopolitan on Tucker's show. It's like he's never really been dishonest about who he is.
Right. And I give him credit for that. But I do think that that and his kind of materialist atheist streak are kind of the core weaknesses in his worldview. But again,
I mean, he makes the case for it very clearly in his article / essay called "The Coriolanus and the Conservatives," where he does take the Coriolanus Shakespeare analogy, like he views himself as like a Coriolanus type figure. That's what the dark elves that he writes about are supposed to be. The issue is that, you know, these Volscians, these people that he's not a part of, which is usually flyover white America that is being squeezed out as the tax base through, you know, immigration, globalization, etc. Those people do believe in things, and you know, if you're going to come in and rule over them, like you better have these guys on your side as well. But this is what we're dealing with, and I have Yarvin pegged for a lot of other issues. Him being a materialist atheist is being one of them. But hey, you know, to him, I think he's more focused on power and a little less ideology.
That's well put. Cringewalker for $2. Slowpoke Pokemon.gif, which I think is, you know, some very pertinent political analysis. But thank you, Cringewalker. Anyway, carrying on. Purge the federal bureaucracy and create a new one. Once the new president / would-be monarch is elected, Yarvin thinks time is of the essence. The speed that this happens with has to take everyone's breath away, he told Chow. It should just execute at a rate that totally baffles its enemies. I mean, that's just basic tactics, right?
Millions.
Mm-hmm. Be careful there, Cody. I like my YouTube channel. Yarvin says the transition period before the inauguration should be used to intensively study what's essential for the federal government to do, determine a structure for the new government, and hire many of its future employees. Then, once in power, it's time to retire all government employees of the old regime, sending them off with nice pensions so they won't make too much of a fuss. To circumvent Congress, the president should have his appointees take over the Fed and direct the Fed on how to fund the new regime. Talk of firing vast swaths of federal workers is now common on the right. Good. In late 2020, Trump issued an executive order called Schedule F that would reclassify as many as 50,000 civil servants and middle management as political appointees who could be fired and replaced by the new president. Nothing came of it, and Biden quickly revoked it. But Trump's regime in exile is brainstorming what could be done with it in a second term. And Axios' Jonathan Swan has reported. I'll bring that up. Isn't that the article?
It's the same article. There you go.
He has really read 3 articles, talked to Yarvin for 5 minutes on Zoom, and then just produced this, which is, I guess, you know, a way to make money, but it's a little bit shameless. To Yarvin, even that is a doomed half measure. You could be executing executive power from day one in a totally emergency fashion, he told Anton. You don't want to take control of these agencies through appointments. You want to defund them. You want them to totally cease to exist. This would, of course, involve some amount of chaos, but Yarvin hopes that would be brief and that the actually essential work of government would quickly be taken over by the newly created bodies that could be under the autocrat's control. I mean, to me, and I don't want to have the stream go on forever, but to me, that's, if there were kind of a moderate solution that kind of involves the country maintaining at least its general shape, I mean, that's really the only way I think something could happen that would change our course, short of something kind of like cataclysmic. And within kind of the limited worldview, Yarvin is operating. Look, I understand that the author doesn't like this, but it's at least a relatively kind of like realistic take on what would have to happen, Do you guys have anything to add on that point, or should I go on?
Go ahead.
I'll just say this. It's really hard to make those ideas sound scary. It just is.
And I guess, look, maybe we're desensitized to this, but to me, a lot of this is kind of, like, hey, welcome to 2017. Just, rewritten in kind of like, shitlib English. Ignore the courts. Yeah. The rule of law in America is based on shared beliefs and behaviors among many actors throughout the system, but it has no magical power. The courts have no mechanism to actually force a president to abide by their wishes should he defy their rulings. Yet with certain notable exceptions, they have had an extraordinary track record at getting presidents to stay in line. Defying the Supreme Court means ending the rule of law in the U.S. as it has long been understood. Who would have thought that in the year of our Lord 2020, the libtards of America would be, wringing their hands over rule of law? Yarvin has suggested just that a new president should simply say he has concluded Marbury v. Madison, the early ruling in which the Supreme Court greatly expanded its own powers, was wrongly decided. He also said the new president should declare a state of emergency and say he would view the Supreme Court rulings as merely advisory. Again, God willing. Would politicians back this? J.D. Vance, in the podcast mentioned above, said part of his advice for Trump in his second term would involve firing vast swaths of federal employees. And when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Jackson did and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling. Let him enforce it. Yes. Co-opt Congress. One reason that past presidents may have been reluctant to defy the Supreme Court is that there is one body that can keep them in check. Congress, which can impeach and actually remove a president from office and ban him from running again. I feel like that's kind of a tease there, that last part. Maybe we'll see something like that in the upcoming months. Now, congressional majorities have been gradually getting more deferential to their party's presidents. Yet the threat of impeachment and removal hung over much of Trump's decision-making and likely prevented him from going further in several key moments. For instance, he didn't fire special counsel Robert Mueller, and he backed down and left office after Jan 6th, while Mitch McConnell's allies were leaking that to the GOP Senate leader might support impeachment, an inapparent threat to Trump. Again, I kind of echo Vance and Masters' view on that particular figure, right? Congress also frequently cut Trump out of policymaking, ignoring his veto threats. Again, Trump is kind of the impotent leader. He has the veto power and he would not use it. He cucked. Yarvin's idea here is that Trump, or insert future would-be autocrat, should create an app, the Trump app, and get his supporters to sign up for it. Trump should then handpick candidates for every congressional and Senate seat whose sole purpose would be to fully support him and his agenda, and then use the app to get his voters to vote for them in primaries. Trump has been picking primary favorites, and there's had been some success in seat contests, but this would be a far more large-scale strategic, systematic effort. The goal would be to create personalistic majority that nullifies the impeachment and removal threat, and that gives the president the numbers to pass whatever legislation he wants. If you can win majorities in this way, then congratulations, you've turned the U.S. into a parliamentary dictatorship, Yarvin told Chow. Effectively, the U.S.'s clunky Madisonian separation of powers will have been made moot. I think it could be done by anyone with a few $1 billion to spare. That's how you know it's a real quote. That's how you know it's a real Curtis Yarvin quote. Anyone with a few $1 billion to spare, he continued. This is what pisses me off, that I don't know anyone with billions of dollars who could do this. He then paused, which you can read into as you wish. Such a slang. Okay, to give this guy full credit, that's probably the best transliteration of Yarvin speaking to the written word ever, because that is exactly how he talks. But I will say, I'm not the most kind of bullish on Trump or the electoral system, but I hadn't actually heard his idea for the Trump app yet. And I mean, it's worth a shot. Am I right? You guys have anything to add? Yeah, exactly. It can't really, can it get worse?
He's got that going more or less with who he endorses. And we can tell that he's got some pretty prominent staying power, even though he's been out of office for over a year and some change now. It's, to me, I also think that even what Bannon and whatever your opinion may be of him, his idea of listen, if you're a hardcore Trump guy, you need to start taking over precincts, because that's where precincts have a lot of authority on county and party stuff. If you've ever been a precinct judge, or you've been elected as a precinct chair, then you are supposed to hold precinct conventions, which go to county conventions, and that's the way that you start changing state and national platforms and such. And I've done that stuff before. It is tedious and hard work, and you probably do need a laundry list, maybe $1 billion app guy to put together a list of anyone to apply that could do it, because it's needed.
It's well said. And like I said, I think that obviously that both, Yarvin and, the writer of this article are kind of hinting at Thiel in that, right? Centralized police and government powers. Moving forward in the state of emergency, Yarvin told Anton the new government should take direct control over all law enforcement authorities, federalize the National Guard, and effectively create a national police force that absorbs local bodies. This amounts to establishing a centralized police state to back the power grab, as autocrats typically do. Which, incidentally, I don't know if you guys remember what happened in the year of our Lord 2020. We kind of saw something very similar happen. Where essentially, federal law enforcement kind of made a power play at, local centers of power. and to, again, shamelessly shill another episode of the show. Thomas and I kind of touched on this specifically in our most recent discussion about Chicago, and why the absolute shambling homunculus that is Lori Lightfoot has been kind of airdropped into power there. Whether this is at all plausible in the U.S. anytime soon, well, you'll have to ask the National Guard and police officers. You have to be willing to say, okay, when we have this regime change and we have a period of temporary uncertainty, which has to be resolved in an extremely peaceful way, he says. Yarvin also wants his new monarch's absolute power to be truly absolute, which can't really happen so long as there are so many independently elected government power centers, and especially blue states and cities. So they'll have to be abolished in almost all cases. This would surely be a towering logistical challenge and create a great deal of resistance, to put it mildly. This is my favorite part. Shut down elite media and academic institutions. Now recall that, according to Yarvin's theories, true power is held by the cathedral, so that they have to go too. The new monarch/dictator should order them to be dissolved. You can't continue to have a Harvard or New York Times past the start of April, he told Anton. After that, people should be allowed to form new associations and institutions as if they want, but the existing cathedral power bases must be torn down. This does not end till there are tanks in Harvard Yard, to quote a friend of the show. Do you guys have anything to add to those last couple points?
I just love how this article is pretty much convincing liberals to listen. You guys have to keep supporting the New York Times and Harvard and the Ivy Leagues if you like democracy. You have to keep supporting all of like these, bourgeois, old money, everything that you're supposed to hate kind of institutions, because I think I think this author is smart enough to realize that that is kind of their power hub, or at least that's where they are forming that that next class of elites that AA talks about, the kind of people who become Harvard lawyers and work in politics and then work at Goldman Sachs and then work at NGOs.
Prue, do you have anything to add?
So far, this has been recapping more or less everything that Yarvin's ever wrote, so people can know how radical this guy is, the Vox audience, because this is number one, right, on their current most read articles right now, and this is for them to realize, well, this is how radical they are. What happened in January in 2021 was just the beginning, and we need to do more about this because, look, they have this whole plan in order to sow the seeds of doubt of democracy and to turn out their people and to have tanks in Harvard Yard and to seize the it's getting their people into the much needed midterm panic, and also for them to be okay with their neighbors getting arrested.
No, that's well said. And that's kind of my reading on this. So for time's sake, I'm going to skip this section. You guys can go back to it if you want. It's essentially him kind of fleshing out the section about the Trump app, which, while I hadn't read before, it's not, particularly interesting. You can kind of, fill it in as you want. Sowing the seeds of doubt in democracy. Yarvin and I spoke for nearly 2.5 hours recently. He peppered his comments with hundreds of historical references, and as he often does with left interlocutors, he focused on areas where he appeared to believe he could find common ground. The horror. He was at pains to reassure me that he didn't believe the U.S. regime was going to fall anytime soon, saying this was a generational, not immediate process. Part of my project now is to say, let's make this a little bit less of an abstraction. Let's imagine what it might look like in a way that doesn't scare anyone, he said. It is dangerous. Any kind of serious political change is dangerous. And where we are is also dangerous, he said. He named specifically the possibility of nuclear war in Ukraine, which does seem quite dangerous, though it cannot be laid solely at the feet of democracy.
Huh.
Yes, indeed. And while saying he was not exactly a fan of FDR, he sang the praises of the New Deal Washington as a time when the U.S. government could actually achieve impressive things, bemoaning that it no longer can. All of this is more politic than Mencius Moldbug's old approach of throwing rhetorical bombs at the left. And he's he goes into this. To be honest, don't really want to read this. I read it before. It's just kind of a summary of his, Lord of the Rings thing. That is, he wants to convince liberal elites and leftists to lose faith in the system, believing that when enough of them no longer want to defend it, it will be easier to topple. In his thinking, that's the prerequisite for regime change. When you see cultural elites developing a sense of possibility in a broader sense, which is outside the sort of matrix of conventional belief, then you're like, okay, something interesting is starting to happen, he told me. And among liberals and the left, there is indeed much frustration that our government and political system is becoming sclerotic and effective, that the Constitution is fatally flawed, America can't build anymore, and that the president is frustratingly weak. Ideas to empower the majority party, I'm just opening all of these, expand executive power and take the Supreme Court down a peg, are now commonly debated among Democrats. They share with many on the right the feeling of being locked in a never-ending political combat with a terrifying, powerful other side that endure. I'm really curious what the unfair advantage is. What's the advantage of the electoral republic? Oh, it's just generic EC whining. Sorry, I was actually kind of curious. In the system, while their own leaders aren't doing enough to fight back. But of course, Yarvin's villains, the media, academia, the deep state, are different from the villains in the progressive story. Moneyed interest, bigotry, or systematic bias, religious extremists, ignorant red staters.
Ignorant red staters is last is pretty funny.
It's also like, I think it's hilarious that they're like, that of all people, Vox is complaining about moneyed interests, right? And what he'd want his monarch to do with all that power is different too. He's written about his idea to deter crime by putting an ankle monitor on anyone who's not rich or unemployed, based, and create relocation centers for decivilized subpopulations. This is a euphemism I'm going to use in the future. Decivilize subpopulations. So if you're trying to increase left-right agreement, the current system is fatally flawed. I asked him, is it really possible to please both sides about what the new system will offer? Might you be trying to sell the left a bill of goods, claiming this future monarchy will be better than when it actually will be far worse for them? Neither side should be sold a bill of goods, he answered. This is not a homogenous country. It's never been. There are a lot of people in this country who have to share the same land. That's a solvable problem. He referenced the long-running conflict between plebeians and patricians in the Roman Republic, which he said was made irrelevant by Julius Caesar and his successor, Augustus's centralization of power. Imagine in America if this red state, blue state, race war, class war, all this shit, it's just gone, he said. The picture was so rosy that the music of John Lennon began playing in my head. I had a stupid, late night tweet where I said, given a time machine and a gun, it would be a toss up between going back in time to kill John Lennon before he wrote Imagine and beating John Wilkes Booth to the punch. And after reading this, I think
really
Lennon
should have just
definitely wins out.
imagined that there was no snub-nosed 38 revolvers. John Legend would, John would still be the legendary singer that he is, not a corpse, but
Fair enough, right? It is certainly possible to imagine a much more effective government under one-man rule than the one we have now. Perhaps if we picked out the perfect, brilliant, ingenious, compassionate king with a wise board of directors he'd respect rather than supplant, it would all work out. It could also work out very poorly.
Also, I love that this guy is just like, well, you're selling us something, but it's actually going to be worse for us. Oh my gosh, less crime, less homeless people camped out on the streets, 1,200 people dying every day for a pair of shoes. Like, really? This is bad for you? Get fucked.
Excuse me, we need the crime. That's cultural enrichment by decivilize subpopulations. Even if the darkest scenarios don't come about, it's a funny paraphrase.
Enriching my civilization with lead from decivilized subpopulations.
Guys, there could be decivilized subpopulations here. With a car, you can go anywhere.
Purely economic factors have decivilized those populations, of course. Even if the darkest scenarios don't come about, sclerosis and decay are hardly problems unique to democratic systems. They've affected autocracies throughout history up to today. It is difficult to ensure the leader's incentives are focused on good governance rather than on entrenching himself in power. The corporate model which Yarvin praises often leads to dysfunctional bureaucracy, not to mention a governing country might simply be a different sort of problem than running a company. Again, refer to Hoppe on that one. But in a practical sense, Yarvin's long-term ambition for the new regime matter less than his ideas about how the old one could fall. I actually agree with that. Yarvin's popularity Yarbin's popularity among rising Republicans and New Right intellectuals reveals that his cohort is more and more willing to entertain ideas that are out of the mainstream. Some ambitious figure, or even Trump himself, could well try to follow his playbook in the future crisis. If they do, despite Yarbin's urging that the revolution should be absolutely bloodless, there's no telling how messy things could get. All the declarations that America is currently falling apart could look quaint by comparison to what comes. If the rule of law is shredded and the current order is toppled, if you yank out a tooth, you cannot automatically expect a new and better tooth to grow back. The economist Tyler Cohen, in a critique of the New Right, the best laid plans of revolutionaries often go awry. The fact that we have successfully gotten the shit libs to just essentially start quoting Edmund Burke it breaks my brain. Well, guys, we can't just start changing things. You don't know what could happen. Oh, really? Really? You can't just change things, can you? And look, again, I've harped on this point before. Just saying the left is hypocritical doesn't get you anywhere. But, I mean, this does kind of boggle the mind. And you guys can chip in once I finally finish this essay. When I first asked to speak with Yarvin, he requested that I prove my professional seriousness as a current historian based by reading or at least skimming 3 books, and I complied. One of them, Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, a classic of journalism school canon, describes how people can respond when their previous beliefs about how the world works are called into question. Honestly, it's kind of a power move. Sometimes, if the incident is striking enough, and if he has felt a general discomfort with his established scheme, he may be shaken to such an extent as to distrust all accepted ways of looking at life, and to expect that normally a thing will not be what it is generally supposed to be, Lippmann wrote. In the extreme case, especially if he is literary, he may develop a passion for inverting the moral canon, by making Judas, Benedict Arnold, or Caesar Borgia the hero of his tale. There, I thought of Yarvin, self-described dark elf who yearns for a king. Anyway, we're finally through the article. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that? I thought it was funny that we've essentially turned liberals into quoting Edmund Burke, right? The true horseshoe theory in action.
No, it's like they can change society as radically as they want, because either they consciously know that they're doing it, or they really just are along for the ride. Like they don't really have any kind of independent thoughts, because the fact that we have so many interactions at the border, that we're seeing all this disgusting stuff being put on kids, take your own advice, read the article. If you do revolutionary things, you're going to push people to a point of no return, essentially.
Yeah, we've gotten to that point of no return with the kids. It's depressing when you'll see 23-year-old women that look like manlets with stage 3 Norwood complaining about what's happened to them, and that's it's a tragedy. And the people that have done this and pushed this on kids should be drawn and quartered for starters. But this article is a nice recap, more or less, of sort of the evolution of Curtis Yarvin's ideas, quoting stuff from UR back in 2008 to more recently, just like a year ago. I find it like a bit of a flex that he's telling journalists to go read Public Opinion by Lippmann, because journalists are the perfect example of people who live in their own pseudo realities, as Lippmann would put it. But I mean, the one complaint that I really do have as of late has been this new right push to be like FDR or the New Dealers, because it's just like, maybe we don't want to be the people that fomented the managerial revolution and extended the Great Depression by 7 years and destroyed the last remnants of the America that could have made it into the 20th century. But of all the people that we talk about, especially with James Burnham, I really do wish people would read more of the People's Pottage, and that came, especially the revolution was in 1938, than say 1941's managerial revolution. But hey, if the libs are going to be Burkeans now, then it should be really easy to be just like the real Edmund Burke, not be read, not be listened to, and go for the more hardcore guys and just step over them.
And I will second that. The People's Pottage by Garrett, I believe,
Yeah.
is quite good and well worth your time, kind of as a a contemporary kind of recounting of like the FDR regime. It to me it taught me several things I just didn't know about FDR's regime, and it also kind of it shows the ground that was kind of laid for the conservative movement in America. And it's kind of, obviously, even as, I think none of us would probably describe ourselves as, like quote unquote conservatives. It's good to know your intellectual history. And it's good to know that, that it's FDR wasn't based. FDR wasn't cool. FDR was a bad guy. FDR did things that were, flat out, immoral. Mutant number 12 for $5. Zoomers will undo this version of the unqualified. Money from Naboo. Thank you for the money, and maybe you have more faith in the Zoomers than I do. But again, here's hoping.
Money from Naboo. I'm now just thinking about all of the Jar Jar Binks tweets by Thomas.
I love Thomas on Twitter so much, and every time he gets banned, it's truly sad. The Jar Jar Binks posting by Thomas, and look, like Thomas has some great serious work out there. Like really, like his I enjoy his fiction quite a lot. His revisionism is important, but every time I see one of his the screenshots of his Jar Jar Binks posting, I just piss myself laughing. It's the funniest thing in the world to me.
He really is like. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, but he's also like a huge 12-year-old.
Well, he's just funny. Like he's funny straight up. There's no two ways about that. And again, if I can do some shilling for someone else on this account, check out his Telegram. It's well worth it. There's informational stuff in there, and there's also just he's a funny guy, and there's a lot of stuff in there that'll make you laugh.
He was going off on Telegram earlier today.
And you know what? We're gonna end that conversation right there. Because again, I like my YouTube channel. I have no I have no illusions that I'm gonna keep it for long, but I prefer not to lose it immediately. I have some super chats again from Cringe Walker from my last stream. So I'll read those out because those actually are not I think that could dovetail at least mildly with this conversation. Cringe Walker for $5 yesterday said, I hate to leave black pills, but if we're totally honest, the kind of life that would make a Caesar is the kind of life a mother would abort. And then for $2, he said a few minutes later, maybe without Roe, he'll be born now. That's something interesting. I know, a mutual friend, Paul Fahrenheit has said that, Caesar will be a Whigger, meaning that essentially, like he probably will come from kind of a rough background. Maybe there's some truth in that. I'm maybe less convinced. I think that elites tend to be replaced by elites, and only very rarely does someone kind of truly come, from the bottom of society to kind of turn it all on its head. Again, I'd be happy to be wrong on that one. And any blow against Roe is, a moral victory, if nothing else, in my book. Do you guys have anything to add on that front?
Baron Trump, assume your destiny.
He's like freakishly tall, isn't he? Like he's like 6'7" or something ridiculous. Because every photo I see him in, which admittedly might all be edited, he looks like just a giant among men, like a Nephilim.
No, he's 6'7".
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I was about
dude,
to say that.
He's built like a power forward, man. It's impressive.
This article was interesting. It was good to read it because it's very easy to kind of get siloed into your own like niche, I guess, like internet community where you forget that not everyone has heard of the like series of esoteric right-wing blogs you have. But it did very much kind of feel like an article out of time. Like this is still where we're at. Like we haven't really progressed past this. And I guess maybe the conclusion to this, if we can, slowly bring things to a close, is, what Dave the Distributist, who I believe is live now, you guys should head out after this to see him, is, what he said, that look, like you can get over Yarvin when you actually get past him, when you actually internalize what he said. And look, I think that Yarvin has kind of started to a certain extent, besmirch his legacy. A lot of the things that he's been doing, with Grey Mirror, people kind of haven't felt like they've been up to his previous standards. And, again, that's kind of up to anyone's personal personal opinion, but I do truly feel like that. Look, there are things to be learned from Yarvin. And you ignore him at your own peril. And I think that the very fact that he is being kind of taken up by at least the marginally more effective members of the Republican Party in the U.S. As sclerotic and as evil and as dysfunctional as that party is, it's something to pay attention to, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I think that that's what we're seeing now, especially is the Yarvin evolving himself to be more to that palatable audience. That sort of the old style of like right wing anons are kind of becoming the harbinger sort of consumers of him, the people he'd like to shed as he moves on to the next project or the next product in his evolution of thought. And Dave's right. Like, there's a lot of things that Yarvin did get correct, and a lot of lines of thinking that you should keep in mind: manipulation of procedural outcomes, etc. Especially how meme plexes work. I think Dawkins got pwned has aged better than the open letter, but I really do think that in this regard, that we're going to see things change. The second thing, though, that I'll add to wrap up my thoughts here is that for us, this article seems very well out of time. But to your average, liberal reading Vox, this is probably new information. And this is probably new information for a lot of people, including, those not politically involved or read a little bit of everything. And it does illustrate that, we are a part of a group of people that would consider our ideas normal or correct or whatever you may want to call it, besides based, because we are. But to many people, this is outside fringe stuff that we also need to be aware of, that, we are going to have an uphill battle in regards to that marketing thing. And if there is one person I will shill, it's Charlemagne's free article on his Substack, Neoreactor, talking about the real problem of the dissident right, which is not a monolith, but it certainly has a damn, some of our audience members are kind of fucked up, basically. So I'd recommend people read that.
And I concur on that recommendation. I will say, as a relative newcomer to these circles, some of y'all sincerely need to touch grass, and I say that with a little bit of love. Cowboy K in the chat says, "I wonder how Yarvin feels that his open letter to progressives continues to fail with his intended audience and was a huge success in these circles." I think that that's actually part of it. I'm going to echo what you said, Prude. I do think that how Dawkins got pwned, while not his most, cited work, has aged much better. And conceptualizing ideas and meme plexes as he does is a really useful kind of categorical tool. And if I could recommend a starting place, I know everyone says start with open letter. Start with how Dawkins got pwned. It's full of some like 2008 era, internet leak gamer speak that's a little bit annoying. I personally have a hard time with Yarvin's writing style. I think it's an acquired taste, but there's good thought in there. And like I said, Prude, you're dead right about it's easy to forget how much of a minority you are. Even among those who would consider themselves, right wing or conservative or even Republican. These ideas are still niche. And if you've been in these circles for a year, for 2 years, for 5 years, it's easy to feel like, oh, this is passé. We've covered this ground before. But remember, we are a vanguard. And obviously that doesn't mean that we need to win 50 plus 1%, but maybe be a little bit kinder to the people still catching up. Because a lot of us, myself included, are relative latecomers. And the eternal kind of quest for novelty, the quest for something, eternally more esoteric and based and, different than everyone else, I think is kind of a fool's errand. So I'm going to kind of formally bring this stream to an end. Do you want to, plug anything before we go, Cody?
I don't really have anything to plug other than my Twitter and, anyone who wants to have a good conversation, my DMs are always open. Feel free to DM me, interact with me. We'll joke around a little bit, hop in some spaces. And on a more serious note, God loves you and wants you to come home. That's all I'll say.
All right. And Prude, you got anything to plug?
Yes, so this Thursday at 1:15 p.m. Eastern, Gio and I will be live for another episode of the Digital Archipelago. We'll be talking about what scares people and what constitutes for good horror in a very fake and gay world, so I hope that you all tuned into that, and I'll put some stuff out on the recent Rishi Sunak news coming out. But I guess the only other thing that I would add is that, Christ says pick up your cross and follow him, so start doing that.
Again, well said, Prude. So as far as my plugs, links are down in the description. This is not my normal content. This is kind of an additional stream I did because it's fun and I enjoy hanging out with these guys. But it's normally numbered episodes of my interview podcast. Those are both on YouTube, obviously, and then also on Spotify and Apple, anywhere else you listen to audio only podcasts. This week I've got George Bagby on tomorrow to discuss All the King's Men, my favorite book and the source of my pseudonym. And then on Thursday, I'm going to have Ryan Turnipseed on again to discuss the ZQ. So anyway, guys, thank you guys for coming out, and I'll talk to you all later. Good night.